All right, everyone. Thank you for coming to the Energy Symposium, the first one for the spring 2020 semester. Next week's talk will be Joni Carswell of Texan by Nature. She is CEO and president of the organization known as Texan by Nature, and they have the mission to bring business and conservation together for long-term and sustainable impact. She is going to talk about collaborative engagement, or collaborative conservation within the energy industry. So it's a sort of Texas organization, and with their take on how to bring people together and stakeholders together in the energy industry in this particular context of her talk, but for conservation, environmental conservation in general. So that would be next week's talk. Today, we are pleased to have Dr. Saul Hart from the University of Michigan. Saul is Associate Professor of Communication and Media and for the program in the environment at the University of Michigan. So if you have questions on how people communicate information and understand information in the media and create collaborations, this is also similar to next week's talk, and this will be informative in this regard. And so he's going to talk to us specifically, I guess, about engaging the public on issues related to climate mitigation or carbon mitigation, and specifically some issues on energy, renewable energy and carbon dioxide storage. So with that said, I will welcome our speaker, Saul. Let's thank him for coming. Thank you very much, Saul.
All right, let me just, is this a good level of projection? Can you guys hear me okay? Yeah, awesome. Thanks so much for having me. I'm really happy to be here and talk to you. And like Harry just said, I'm really interested in engaging the public in renewable energy, carbon dioxide removal. This is coming partly about how do you communicate about climate change, so that's going to be a running theme through today. Just a little bit about my research focus. I do environment, science communication. I'm really interested in judgment decision making, environmental psychology, and how it relates to sustainability, environment, and science issues. So broadly, that's what I'm interested in, is doing strategic communication around these issues, and then also understanding how that discourse appears on things like Facebook and other places. So what I want to talk to you guys about today, briefly talk about climate change impacts, talk a little bit about how the media environment is politicized and polarized today, and then some studies that I and collaborators have done over the last few years. So one is talking about the impacts and actions of climate change. One is whether in some cases it would be better not to talk about climate change. And then finally about the moral hazard of communicating about carbon dioxide removal and how that can come up. So that's the territory I'm coming. I would say if there's anything you don't understand, please raise your hand and let me know. But otherwise, I would love to have conversation, answer questions, but to save that until the end. Okay, so first, talking about climate change impacts. Now, I mean, you can take whole classes on this, and I'm not an expert, I just read the science articles on this. But I want to talk about a few that have come up recently that, at least when I talked with my classes about it, the students tend to not widely know it, so I feel like it's worth sharing. And one is this. So there's been a number of editorials in Science Advances, which is one of the leading science journals, on this idea of Amazon rainforest tipping point. The Amazon rainforest, to some degree, creates its own weather. It creates humidity. And the research suggested that once the deforestation rate reaches 40%, it'll start kind of an irreversible transition towards savanna and away from being a rainforest. Most of the rainforest in South America has been deforested about 17%. In Brazil, it's about 20%. But why I mention it is because climate change dramatically reduces that, right? So instead of being 40%, it's closer to 20 to 25% level of deforestation will start to trigger that change. And I mentioned that because the articles I've read, some scientists are saying this could start as early as 2021. Other climatologists saying, no, you have at least 10 years, but then in 10 years this process starts, right? But suggesting that very soon that there may be a large dramatic impact in the rainforest. A few others I wanted to mention, California, which is where both my mom and my dad are from, they've seen an increase in wildfires. They're about 500% larger now than they were historically. And some folks at some of the Cal State Universities have done modeling, and they suggest if we were to take no change at all around climate change, by 2070, about a quarter to a half of the forest in the university would burn in any given year, although that wouldn't happen because there wouldn't be any forests left. It's unlikely that there would be no change in society along those lines, but those are some of their projections around that. And then I wanted to share this, which is from Nature Climate Change. And what they modeled was the likelihood of events that would occur with increases of, so that is not the right button. That's the right button. All right. Increase of 1.5 degrees Celsius and 2 degrees Celsius. And the few that I'll point out here, so in 2012 and 2013, there was a very bad fire summer, and so the question was, how likely is that to occur again? In the current environment, I guess the current wildfires you're hearing about in Australia, those should not be unexpected based on this, right? So this is the annual likelihood of that occurring. But these are then the increases of 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius. You see increases of 57% or 77% per year based on that. In 2016, about half of the Great Barrier Reef was bleached. And again, that would rarely happen, but as that increases, it would be likely that not only the Great Barrier Reef, but all coral reefs would be lost. And then that's compounded by increasing rates of drought. And I say that because it means that images like this coming from Australia would be likely to continue in the future. I will say one thing about this. The New York Times actually had an article by the photographer. The kangaroo lives, so you know that. But I will also note this was taken midday, right? So that's the level of smoke that was in the air as this was occurring. So I say that not to, I think, promote fatalistic or catastrophic thinking, but just merely to more say that there are a lot of likely impacts and that there's an urgency to shift things. And I think talking about renewable energy, carbon dioxide removal is part of the package that will help address some of these issues. So unlike climate change impacts where if you have questions on that science, I'm not the person asking about that. I'm just reporting what the science articles say. But I am an expert in the media environment and politicization and polarization in that. So I want to give you some recent polling on that. So this is from Gallup. They've done a series of questions, and what they say is, in general, do you think news organizations get the facts straight, or they're often inaccurate? This green line here is Democrats, the gray is independents, the dark green is Republicans, and you see that in the late 90s, basically about half of Democrats and Republicans were saying the same thing. There wasn't a difference between them. Democrats have stayed fairly in the same range, going between 40 and 60%, but there's been a dramatic reduction in trust in the media for Republicans. And I think that goes along with a lot of elite conservative opinion saying don't trust the mass media, and that has had an effect on Republicans. This is another Gallup poll. So as this is saying, getting the facts straight, this is saying that you have trust and confidence in the mass media. You see a similar pattern. This is more data points because they've asked this more often. But again, an increasing divide between this, and particularly amongst Republicans, a fair amount of distrust. This is a 2014 Pew Research Center. These columns, originally, they all went together as one long column. So over here, this is just a continuation of this. I just split it so it'd be bigger and easier to see. What this is saying is basically how much do you trust this source of news? The red is more trusted than distrusted, gray is about equal, and then yellow is more distrusted than trusted. Two things come out of this. One is that liberals in general trust a broader range of news sources than conservatives do. And that conservatives, especially individuals who self-identify as consistently conservative, tend to only trust conservative sources. So to go through it on this far right column, you see it's Rush Limbaugh, Glenn Beck, Sean Hannity, Drudge Report, Breitbart, Fox News, The Blaze, and The Wall Street Journal. I'll also note that for conservatives, about 47% of conservatives only get their news from Fox News. But why I think this is interesting is if we were to do this 20 years ago, there would be much more agreement and trusted news sources. When this was taken in 2014, the only news source that across the political spectrum was taken was the Wall Street Journal, right? Yeah?
The Wall Street Journal is a lot different than Fox News.
It is a lot different than Fox News.
Yeah, and so...
Okay, so what I would say is that the Wall Street Journal... So the comment was that Wall Street Journal is very different than Fox News, and it's not fair to lump those two together. Is that a fair reflection? And so I would say two things about that. So one, for the most part, for the mainstream reporting of the Wall Street Journal, I would say it's very good. It does take a more business slant. In research I'm not talking about today on environmental issues, it still tends to report in a more conservative manner. But it's... no, and I would agree with that. And I guess, yeah, I would say the editorial page is very conservative, right? But the straight news reporting is not. Still, it's considered a more conservative leading paper. But and with that said, and I think that part of what you're saying is reflected in that mostly and consistently liberal people also say it's a trusted news source, right? What I am saying, though, is that we don't have a broad range of news sources that people across the political spectrum accept as trustworthy. And so that's the point that I'm trying to make there. But I actually think that's a good point of clarification in that I wouldn't group this style of reporting of the Wall Street Journal and Fox News together, whereas I might put Fox News much closer to others like Breitbart and things like that. But what this does point to, that I think, is a dramatic amount of polarization in what people trust. And so partly related to that and looking at climate change coverage specifically, this is a project I did with Sedona Chin and Stuart Soroka. Sedona was my PhD student. She's about to head to Wisconsin. Stuart Soroka is also at the University of Michigan. And so the brief history of that, Stuart Soroka, he's a big data scientist, and he collected every news story he could find on environmental news for the last 30 years. So he has about 2 million article database. We created a dictionary, and for time I didn't put it here, but basically just a simple dictionary trying to say, do they mention a politician? Do they mention a scientist? And what does that look like over time? And what we find is, in terms of mentions per article, so this is just saying that in a given article they would mention one of these once. You see the rate of political mentions going up, the rate of scientific mentions going down, so they're about even today. This tends to indicate that there's a greater politicization of the issue in the media. Now, what I'm not capturing is, what are these politicians saying, right? I mean, you could say, well, if they're talking about solutions to climate change, then it's fair that you have more political mentions, right? So our dictionary does not capture that, but it does capture just that it's an increasingly politicized issue. We did compare this with fracking, which is more politicized, and recycling, which is not. We actually see this increase in politicization of the issue here. And you see that with recycling stories, they aren't talking to scientists or politicians much at all, which I think is probably not surprising. All right. The other thing we looked at was polarization, and here we used an algorithm called word scores. This is something that Stuart Soroka is an expert in, and there's a little bit of a black box. So if you want to know how this is done, I'm happy to follow up with you on literature on that. But what it's trying to measure is just when we see a partisan of one kind mentioned, does their language dramatically differ from each other or not? And what we see is, following the kind of Tea Party election in 2010, there's an increase in polarization by party when they're mentioned in conjunction with climate change. Which is really to say that in recent years we've seen increased politicization of the issue in the mass media, and also an increase in polarization in how politicians are talking about it in the media. So, overall climate change media trends is that there tends to be more political coverage. When it's covered in a more political way. There is less science coverage in terms of less scientists are mentioned per article. And there tends to be more polarization in how different political actors talk about the issue. And I set that up just to say that this is a polarizing media environment, but I think it's also a polarizing social environment that we find ourselves in. And so the question is, how do we talk about that? And part of this is then in ways that might encourage support for renewable energy, mitigation policy, those kind of initiatives. So it used to be, if you go back to the late 90s and into, I'd say, about 2012, a lot of communication scholars were saying, well, you just got to frame the issue the right way, and that'll work great. And a lot of research recently has been quite skeptical of this. These are two articles from Nature Climate Change. This one is from 2012, saying promoting pro-environmental action and climate change deniers, suggesting that framing the issue in certain ways, say talking about climate change in terms of national security versus public health, will have it resonate more with conservatives. In this 2016 article by Bernauer, They used the exact same stimulus as these authors did, and they found totally null results, right? And I would say that is somewhat consistent with my own research. It's difficult to find main framing effects with a lot of climate change type stimulus. And so the question is, if that doesn't work, how might you create messages that resonate with the public? And so what we got interested in is then questions of, well, impacts and actions. O'Neill, Boykoff, and others, they did some Q sorting with imagery for climate change engagement. I'm not going to show you the whole study, but just as a setup, their overall finding was that impact imagery tend to increase the perceived importance of the issue, but it also undermined efficacy, meaning that if you show me an image of a flood, I'm going to really care about the issue, but also think there's nothing we can do about it, I feel overwhelmed. They found that energy futures, and these are things like wind power, solar power, electric vehicles, made people feel more like there's something I can do about it, and so that could be effective. But this had not been experimentally tested. Q-sort methodology is where basically you give people a series of images, you'll have a grid, and you'll say, organize these images how they make you feel. We were interested, well, if you actually manipulate messages along these ways, how might that influence perception of the issue? So this is a project I did with Lauren Feldman, who's an associate professor at Rutgers, and we had a 15-cell design, so we used 5 images. What we did is we constructed truthful stories about climate change, and we either paired those with one of these images, which was solar panels, the climate protest, flooding, or smoke from a smokestack, or no image at all. And then we also had a text manipulation where we'd only talk about actions that could be taken to address climate change, only talk about the impacts of climate change or some combination of both. It was a fully crossed design, meaning it's a full 15-cell 3x5 design. And we were interested in how political party might moderate the effect of these types of messages, also how they would influence mediators of efficacy and issue importance, and then finally promotion of energy conservation and willingness to take political action. That mediation model looks like this. So this is our experimental manipulation of imagery and text. We're then looking at it, how it might affect these mediators of perceived issue importance and perceived efficacy, and then how those may influence political action and energy conservation. I should note, if any of you don't like cross-sectional mediation, that is what we're doing here, meaning that that both these are measured at the same time. We don't have a time delay, but theoretically they should run in that order. So what do we find? So I'll just show you the main effects. So this is the influence of using different imagery. Solar panels is here, and there isn't a difference between solar panels and the climate protest, but there is between solar panels and flooding, smoke from a smokestack, or no image. This is on perceived efficacy. All that means is that if you show a solution, renewable energy is an example. I don't know what I did, but that using something like solar panels will make someone feel like, oh, there is something we can do to address climate change. We also looked at, I think, this unpaired. Still not happy. Okay. Still on. Okay. Yeah, we can do this. Okay, we also looked at how did the text, right, using action or impact test. And we found that using action language made people feel there was more they could do about it. Combination of action and impact was somewhat in between, and impacts only was a little lower. Although it's not like impacts was at the bottom of the scale, all these are somewhat in that neutral field of like 4 to 5 for where they are. All right, we didn't find any influence of text or imagery on perceived issue importance, meaning the suggestion of imagery like flooding dramatically increasing perceived issue importance we just didn't see in our results. And we did a follow-up study, we also didn't see it there. I don't know if there's something different between Q sorting and experimentally testing this, but that's what we found. For political party, I think this is kind of probably not surprising that Democrats felt there was more that you could do than Republicans. Also for perceived issue importance, Democrats have a stronger perception of issue importance than Republicans. But I do want to pause here and note that in some surveys, Republicans are saying like they don't care about climate change. In ours, we found, and this is above neutral, this is a 7-point scale, and we do find that it's about a 5 out of 7, right? So at least with this data, which is a fairly robust data set. It's not representative, but it is at least suggesting for our sample. It's not that they didn't care about the issue, but they did tend to think it was less important than Democrats did. So in terms of the mediation, just to kind of draw out what that means, is that using, say, a solar image versus not using an image, it increases perceptions of efficacy, which then, efficacy had a positive correlation with energy conservation and political action, meaning it's likely that that would increase those perceptions. Same thing, including action also increased efficacy. Again, no influence on issue importance, which had a similar kind of positive association. So, the takeaways from the study, one, imagery of solutions are great. So I would say talking about this issue with images of things you can do tended to resonate with the public. Including actions in the text also seems to work well. O'Neill had a concern that using impact imagery would dramatically reduce perceived efficacy. We didn't find that in these results. So I'm not, at least in terms of pairing impact and action language together, I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing to do, right? That could probably be encouraged. Okay, so would it be better to not talk about climate change? So this was a follow-on thing that we were thinking about. Well, we have a really polarizing information environment, and maybe there are cases where by avoiding the polarizing issue, that might be a better public communication strategy. So this was also done with Lauren. We did 2 studies and I'll report on both of them. So what this is, with a lot of initiatives, there is a benefit of climate change, but there's other things that can benefit from the action you might be proposing. And our question was, well, what if you focus on those risks and benefits that are not related to climate change? So I'll give you an example. A power plant emissions that can include a lot of things that can cause issues, like mercury, dioxins, sulfur dioxide, and particulates from a coal plant. These have a lot of negative effects. It causes more premature births, causes increase of heart attacks, causes increased rates of asthma. So the argument is that there's a value in limiting those emissions regardless of climate change, right? So if you're promoting renewable energy to lower these emissions, or you're promoting regulation to limit these emissions, you can make that argument without talking about climate change and make a public health argument, and that was our question, is how is that perceived? And part of our interest was is some mixed results in previous studies. Petrovic had found that health frames were more effective than climate. Spence had found that climate change frames were more effective. Although the Spence article is about promoting on-campus energy sustainability, whereas Petrovic was about with a larger general population. Carrico had mixed results. And there was also a confound in the Petrovic study. I'm not going to go through it now in the interest of time, but there was a confound between health and environment frames where they're conflated in some of the conditions. We were interested in clearing that up. Our study was just doing a 2x2 simple, talking about power plant emissions in terms of health impacts or environmental impacts, and in terms of climate change or air pollution. Both of those can have an influence on both of those factors. So we used YouGov, so this is a nationally representative sample, although it's weighted to create that with 1,000 people. We used a very simple design. So we did not, unlike the imagery story I talked about before, we didn't use a constructed news article. We just gave these 2 sentences. The reason is there was some indication from Petrovic that, for example, mentioning fossil fuels could change people's opinion. We just wanted to do a very straightforward approach. So our manipulation is emissions from power plants cause, and then we either said air pollution or climate change, and then air pollution or climate change is very harmful to human health or the environment. And so that's the 2x2 manipulation. And this is what we found. So first, just looking at the main effect of climate change versus air pollution. Across the board, we found that it lowered policy support and so again, policy support here is not climate change mitigation. Policy support is supporting renewable energy, supporting regulations on emissions of power plants, just to be clear about that. And then the other thing we looked at, so I know this is messy, let me just walk you through it. First, political party tended to let more support, meaning Republicans had less support for this kind of policy. We also looked at all of the interactions that occurred, also environment versus health, and thankfully for time. None of those other main effects or interactions were significant. So there you go. But we did look at an indirect effect of a belief. Basically, do you think the statement that you write is true? We found that for climate change, less people believed it was true. This belief statement did have a positive association with policy support. And again, this framing effect of environment versus health, it didn't seem to make a difference, right? We've had no main effect there. We were interested in moderation by political party, and so we tested that, and this is what the graph looks like. So what you see is a general downtrend by political party, but so I guess, okay, that's out of battery, so I'll point. All right, gray is climate change, black is air pollution. You see for Democrats and independents, there's not really a difference between talking about it in terms of air pollution or climate change. But we do see a difference for Republicans, where kind of belief that the statement is true is higher for air pollution than it is for climate change, meaning that there's a greater belief that power plants are causing air pollution and air pollution is leading to these kind of effects. I'll note again, this is a 7-point scale, 4 is the midpoint, so it's above that for there. So what does this tell us? Is that we have a significant negative indirect effect for Republicans. So again, if you remember, there's a significant total main effect for everybody that was negative for climate change, but this indirect effect through belief is also negative for Republicans. So the conclusion here is that climate change lowered belief in policy support, especially for Republicans. We didn't see a factor in environment versus health. In terms of implications, if you were going to be an activist in terms of you want to limit power plant emissions, using kind of co-benefit or co-risk messaging might be more effective. Another way I would say that is that I don't think anyone should lie with an audience, but focusing on air pollution in this context may resonate with conservative audiences more than using a climate change focus, I guess is how I would phrase that. We did a follow-up study. This was also with YouGov with 1,000 people. It was a separate panel that we did with YouGov. We're interested in about policy resonance. And so I'll just show you the design because that explains what I mean with policy also. So we had 3 conditions. How much do you support or oppose the following policy is a way to help, and then there were 3 options. So participants only saw one of these statements. They either saw reduce greenhouse gas emissions and stop climate change, or they saw reduce air pollution and its related health effects, or they saw reduce U.S. dependence on foreign sources of oil. And we asked them, and so this is about the ideological resonance, about 4 policies. 1, require fossil fuel companies to pay a tax on carbon emissions, basically a carbon tax. Imposing tougher fuel efficiency standards for cars and trucks. Increasing government investment in renewable energy, such as wind and solar. Or expanding the use of nuclear power plants to generate electricity. And I'll say our main interest here was in the nuclear power question because that tends to resonate more with conservative audiences than with liberal audiences. This is what we found in terms of those policy support. So this is a little small. Actually, let me explain this. I put a lot of information on. So you see 3 colored bars. This dark one on the left is the climate change. This middle one is air pollution. And then the one that's in between is energy security. And what we see is that you do see the normal stratification between political parties, generally having Democrats more supportive than Republicans are. But we look within each one, we see in the carbon tax, when you frame it in terms of climate change, there is less Republican support than if you frame it in terms of air pollution. That pattern holds up when you talk about fuel efficiency and also when you talk about renewables. But the pattern changes when you talk about nuclear energy. And I think why is because the ideological resonance of wanting to support nuclear power in general means that even if that's in terms of climate change, because there's a general support for that outcome, that climate change becomes less polarizing. We also asked about cost versus benefits, and I'll just say we see the same pattern across the board. Right? So instead of asking about the policy support, when you think about the cost versus benefits, do you think it's more costly or more beneficial? That view changes depending on that. So are you guys okay on the slide? Yeah? Okay. So the conclusions are that the climate change context is more polarizing than air pollution and energy security, meaning that there's a greater difference between political views in terms of supporting those policy initiatives when it's in a climate change context. That message effect seemed to be limited to Republicans, but it also was dependent on the policy context. So the last study that I want to talk about today is about the moral hazard of communicating about carbon dioxide removal. So this is a study I did with Victoria Campbell-Arve, Caitlin Ramey, and Kim Wolski. Kim used to be at Michigan, now she's at University of Chicago. And what happens, and we're interested, if you talk about carbon dioxide removal, how might that influence perceptions of climate change? So carbon dioxide removal, there's a lot of types of technology that can be used for this, but basically this is the idea of not limiting emissions, but actively pulling carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So the research question is, a lot of conversations about we have climate emissions of some kind, we've got to put a cap on it. And then we can also talk about this active removal of carbon dioxide. The question is if we talk about that, how might it influence our perception of mitigating or stopping climate change emissions? So that was a question. And part of why that's important is because in terms of the overall impact that we're likely to see, capping emissions is going to have a much larger impact than carbon dioxide removal. And so if that potentially has a negative influence on perceptions of that, that's really important to know. Types of carbon dioxide removal. Let me say a lot of these are still being developed, right? They're hypothetical methods that could be used, but they aren't implemented at this point. One is reforestation, which is you plant a bunch of trees. That we know how to do. You just need a lot of land to do it. But basically, as the trees grow, they absorb carbon dioxide. Another is bioenergy and carbon capture and storage. What that means is you're still growing trees, but then you use these trees in a power plant as biomass for fuel. That will generally still emit carbon dioxide. So then the idea is that you pull out that CO2, you compress it, and you sequester it somewhere, maybe underwater. The other is direct air capture, and this is where you have these huge constructions. Basically, they're these large fans, maybe up to 4 stories high. They will blow air across a liquid that has a chemical composition that absorbs CO2 from the atmosphere. This is the most expensive version of this because you are just literally paying to pull carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. So what does learning about carbon dioxide removal do? Does it increase or decrease the perceived threat of climate change? Why we were asking that is because 2 ideas that are somewhat in competition with each other. One is the idea of risk compensation. This is from Carrico. Risk compensation is remedies designed to reduce the impacts of high-risk behavior. It can have the unintended consequence of reinforcing it by reducing the actual perceived risk of engaging in the action. Okay, what does that really mean? It means that if I talk to you about carbon dioxide removal until you can fix it, you might think, all right, well, that'll solve the problem. I don't need to worry about it anymore. I don't need to take action. Risk salience, though, is a competing kind of theory that says learning about adaptation information may make climate change impacts more salient and thus increase concern for climate change and support for preventative measures, meaning like climate change is bad, you're telling me we need to do this to address it, and I'm going to support these other initiatives more as well. We need to take action. So we did an online survey-based experiment with 984 adults. This was based out of a Qualtrics survey panel. They were randomly assigned to 1 of 5 vignettes. One was, we only told them about climate change. We told them about climate change and carbon dioxide removal in general, or these 3 specific approaches, which is reforestation, biocarbon capture, or the direct air capture. And what we found was as follows. Oh, I want to show you the vignettes. I know this is too small to read, and I'm not going to read it to you. I just want you to see how it was set up, which is that if they only saw climate change, that's what they saw. They saw CDR in general. They still saw that climate change prompt. We just added on the CDR in general. And then if they got a specific version, they saw both of those, and they also saw, in this case it's reforestation, they saw that specific as well. Our measured variables were perceived threat of climate change and also support for climate change mitigation. We also looked at political ideology as a moderator. So that gives you a mediation model that looks like this. And first, in terms of the direct impact on the CDR conditions, perceived threat of climate change, you see that for general CDR, biocarbon capture, and direct air capture, they're all negative. For reforestation, it's not though. Reforestation is basically neutral. But that's at least suggesting that for 3 of those conditions, learning about carbon dioxide removal lowered the perceived threat of climate change. So that's evidence for risk compensation or having a moral hazard. In terms of the positive association between the climate change threat and mitigation policy support is fairly robust at 0.61. And this is the overall indirect effect. And this is basically showing a similar thing, right? With reforestation, we don't have an indirect effect. For the other 3, it's a significant negative indirect effect. So how does political ideology moderate the effects? On this first link, it didn't do anything, which was surprising. We had thought that there would be a political difference on learning about the condition and perceived threat of climate change, but we didn't see it. In terms of the link between threat of climate change and policy support, we did find an interaction. This is what it looks like. What this is telling you is that at low levels of perceived threat, there's a fairly robust difference between conservatives and liberals. At high levels of threat, there's a very small difference between them, basically no difference at all. You could make the argument in terms of directionality, it's actually policy support is associated with that threat difference, but we see that there. And the final is on this direct link from CDR to mitigation policy support, we find that conservatives really like reforestation, that if you tell them about reforestation, that association led to greater mitigation policy support. Okay, I know this is small to see, but I'm going to break it down. So first, just so you have the stats, on the direct effect that I just talked about, this is pulled from that larger regression model, and it just shows that there's a positive association for conservatives with reforestation. And these are the same conditional indirect effects that you saw before, again, just showing that it's negative for those 3, which is similar to the graph I showed you before. So here's the overall finding. Learning about carbon dioxide removal, biocarbon capture, and direct air capture lowered risk perception of climate change, which was associated with lower mitigation policy support. But we don't see this effect for reforestation, which also had a positive effect, direct effect for conservatives. I think the question is, why is there this difference for reforestation? And the truth is, I don't have an empirical answer to you. My gut is that, one, reforestation is something that we know how to do, but also that it feels natural. I think people generally, the idea of having more forests is seen as positive, and so that allowed for that. But again, I think there's more research here that needs to be done. Across all the studies, the takeaways are, one, that we're in a polarized information environment, which I think you already knew, but just noting that for climate change, that polarization has increased in recent years, and politicization has increased in recent years. That if we are going to talk about the issue, using solutions is critical, and so that's both imagery of renewable energy. I've talked about actions that can be taken, and that it's okay to focus on co-benefits and risks of action. I want to reemphasize, I don't think it's good to lie in any situation, but that there can be support for some of these issues, and if you choose not to bring up the polarizing aspect of it, in that study, it was climate change, that might be beneficial. In terms of talking about carbon dioxide removal and the moral hazard that may occur with that, so I have one study suggesting moral hazard may occur. I am not willing to take that to the bank. I really think that we need a lot more research on that, so I feel like I'll just leave that there. But it at least suggests that that is a potential of entering the discourse on carbon dioxide removal. So that's everything I wanted to tell you guys. I will happily answer any questions, and I just want to offer my email address is saulhart@gmail.com. I'm happy to follow up with any of you later too if you want to contact me. So thank you so much for having me here. Yeah. And I'm happy to answer or enter in discussion on anything you guys would like.
All right, anybody who has questions, raise your hand, and we'll come to you with the microphone so we can have the questions. Anyone? Yeah, got one there, Janie.
Hi. You mentioned when you're talking about polarization of language, any sort of literature, and you said you might come back to it later. or like recommend anything about it? Is there anything that would be able to like read or look up to kind of understand more about it?
About the polarization. Well, do you want to know how word scores works or what it means for polarization in general?
What it means for polarization in general?
Okay. Actually, so I'm still going to answer the word scores question, which is that word score, it's an automated computer coding process. It's not assisted by human coders, meaning that it's just looking for similarity or differentiation in language. So that's why it's this abstract score, and we don't have the same kind of language in there. I didn't include it here, but we do have a word map in the actual publication. And I will say that study is coming out in Science Communication in February, so next month it should be out. But the kind of language when we're looking at the actual stories are, with Republicans, there's more of an emphasis on kind of like hoax language, is it real or not, that you don't see in the Democrats. Democrats are more likely to talk about severe impacts of climate change than Republicans are. So I think that's the kind of language that you see in the polarization, meaning that they tend to talk about different things and using different types of language when they talk about it. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Arsalan Eftekar. My question is about the Green New Deal, but more specifically, if you were an advisor to, let's say, Senator Elizabeth Warren, she's recently come out and said that she would ban fracking on her first day as president. How would you kind of play with that message to kind of get Republican and Democratic support? What in your research would you use if she asked you, advise me on how to get the most public support for my policy goals? How would you use your research to advise her?
And specifically to ban fracking?
To ban fracking or the Green New Deal is a whole animal. Don't need to get into that, but I suppose we can start with fracking.
Okay. I mean, I think, well, there's two questions, and I'll say I don't know the polling on fracking specifically because, I mean, during the primary, it's going to be what resonates with the Democratic base, right? Which is maybe different than if you were going to speak to a broader audience, but I think maybe the broader audience is more interesting. I think if I were recommending it, I would talk about the potential negative impacts of fracking. So, I mean, we have seen in Oklahoma and in other areas a dramatic increase in earthquakes as fracking has gone on there. There's been a number of increases in groundwater pollution also by the process. So I think emphasizing that pollution is occurring, and at the same time, the market on solar has changed dramatically, right? So the battery storage isn't quite there yet, but solar is cheaper than fracking in terms of promoting new energy construction. So I think that might be the approach I would take, is if you're taking a market approach, it would make more sense to emphasize these types of renewables that are cheaper, and they have the added benefit of they aren't causing these kind of negative impacts, right? You don't have methane intrusion, you don't have other kind of wastewater pollution that's going on. So I guess that would be the start of what I would talk about. But I think Americans in general don't like pollution. That's not really a politicized thing, right? Everyone wants clean air and clean water. At the same time, we also want jobs, right? And so I think there are now market solutions that also have the benefit of not having the same negative externalities, and focusing on that would be the approach I would take. Yeah.
I just want to make a comment. Apparently, President Trump has mentioned planting trees for carbon removal. And there is this initiative, the Trillion Tree Initiative, which seems to have legs in the conservative community. And I just became aware of this, but when you gave the numbers for who liked what, it resonated with your results.
Yeah, and I agree with that. I think, so what I haven't seen is like why, I still think it's a question of why does it resonate with conservative audience as well, but I mean, that's something where I think there's a really nice synchronicity there and general public support for it, So yeah, so I guess I agree with your comment, but yeah.
But you also found a large moral hazard.
Well, so your thought is that by mentioning that it could limit support for then other types of climate mitigation policy. So we actually didn't see that with reforestation, right? So just to be clear, so like in terms of reducing climate change threat, This is the indirect effect. I can show you the direct effect too. Reforestation did not lower the perceived threat of climate change. Again, here, I mean, I feel awkward presenting results and saying, this is the result. I don't know exactly why this is happening, but that's all I can say to that is like, at least in this study that we did, I don't see it reducing that perceived threat. But it may be possible that with different audiences, or this was also done a few years ago today, that would happen. If the argument is that this could be a conservative strategy to prevent some other types of mitigation measures by promoting this. But yeah, I'll just say, in this study that we did, we didn't see that effect.
Within your studies of actions and, well, I guess images and text as to the efficacy and how those worked, was there any way in your study that you controlled for the different forms of context that people are consuming images and text? So I'm thinking specifically whether it's from news sources, social media, or otherwise, are there conditioning effects that if you pump, think Clockwork Orange, if you pummel them with images, would that change their reaction to a single image? And was your study based on single image exposure or
So
multiple?
and let me say a few things, which honestly the straight answer is I don't know, and it's possible, right? We used a constructed news article context, so we had basically we constructed an article, we sourced it from the Associated Press, it had a single image as a part of it, it wasn't multiple exposures, it was a single news article exposure. So I can't make actual comments on what would repeated exposures do. It was only in a newspaper-based context, so also we weren't experimenting with what if this appears on Twitter and those kind of questions. So I think that's a good question. One study that Lauren Feldman and I are doing now is looking at imagery in terms of impacts and actions in Twitter, and there we are putting multiple Twitter feeds together, I guess Twitter posts, not feeds. And so they're looking at 4 posts and we are manipulating action versus impact language. We're also playing a little bit with climate change versus climate emergency and seeing what results are. We just put that in the field, so I don't know what the results are on that yet. But trying to understand that. And the other important limitation that I'll say across all these experiments is it's forced exposure. Right, so it's not answering the question of what will actually draw people to a message. It's if you sit someone in front of a screen and you show them the message, how do they respond? But this question of selective exposure is a fair one. And yeah, we just need to do more research on that.
I'll follow up with one question while we get to another one. So I think some of your results said whether there was support for climate change or climate change mitigation, thinking about health of the environment. One of your results was something about how there didn't seem to be a difference. Do you have any insight into that? Is it that people inherently associate their health with a healthy environment and so they see them as the same thing, or do you have any idea?
I don't know. So they're really, to start at the end is I don't have the answer to that. I do know that George Mason and Yale, Tony Lazarowitz and Ed Maybach, they got a Robert Wood Johnson grant a few years ago to look at health communication around climate change. It seemed that they did find that using health type messaging seemed to reduce polarization on the issue and reduce some reactions from conservatives. I haven't seen that in my own work. And so I'll just say that, right? So there is some, and that's partly why we were investigating, there is some evidence from other researchers that using this health-based framing can be effective. And so I feel like it's important to mention that. At the same time, with me, we didn't see a difference between environment and health, and I've done 2 other studies along those lines and also don't see a difference. Now your question is, why don't we see a difference? And I don't have the answer to that, and why I'm not seeing a difference, but other individuals are. But yeah, so.
Yeah, thank you for the talk. It seems like one important element here is like a boy who cried wolf effect with the media, because I went to high school in the 90s, and at that time, a lot of people were talking about the hole in the ozone layer, and that was going to kind of get us all if we didn't take immediate action. And then it just kind of went away, and you didn't really hear about it too much anymore. And the media sensationalizes everything. It was Y2K at one point at the turn of the century was going to kill us all, and that seemed maybe overblown. It was killer bees at one point. So in the mind of some conservatives, this is just another one of that literally list of 1,000 things that gets hyped up, and it's the crisis of the decade or whatever that the media likes to talk about. I'm not subscribing to that. I'm just saying that whether that's conscious or subconscious, like I don't know if a conservative-minded person would say that that's why he or she is not a believer, but maybe subconsciously that's just there, that the media sensationalizes everything, and so it's just like the boy who cried wolf.
Yeah, I'll just say my own view. I would subscribe more to the view, which is, it's a little different than what you're saying, but the idea of media sensationalizing things where it's like there's always something new in the headlines, but I don't think the media does a great job of contextualizing what is more or less important. And so sometimes with these ongoing chronic issues, they get reported once or a few times, but they aren't maybe given the amount of coverage that I feel like they should be. And I'll give you two examples of that. One is that in the last 40 or 50 years, the North American bird population is reduced by about 30% in terms of overall numbers of birds. Now, when that study came out, there was national and international coverage of it for one day, right? But it's rarely in newspapers since then. Same thing with the insect population. It's declined about 40% over a similar period of time. Again, when those studies came out, they get a ton of coverage for 1 or 2 days, but then they drop off. So with climate change, it's whenever there's a new study, it'll get coverage, or if there's a really severe impact, like what you see with Australia, right? You'll see an uptick in coverage. But otherwise, I think it's kind of drowned out with a lot of everything else going on in the world. In terms of, I think, seeing other sensationalized things, I think the interpretation of that is probably also partly guided by the political viewpoint of individuals, but yeah, I could see that happening. The ozone is really interesting one because it's not like there were some agreements on ozone, but really what fixed that issue is they found a technological solutions where they didn't need the CFCs, and they just found a cheaper product that did it as well and didn't destroy the ozone. So it ended up being a really easy fix. They didn't have to enter in the kind of like massive regulatory program that you do for climate change. But I don't think that has been publicized as well, right? So, yeah.
So in one of the slides, you showed that nuclear power plants are quite popular among the Republicans. I was wondering why is that, and maybe your thoughts on that.
So I didn't hear the first part of the question.
So nuclear power plants are like really popular among the Republicans.
Oh, yeah.
So they support it much more than the other climate change things. So I was wondering why might be that nuclear power plants are more popular, and your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I think, so nuclear energy and power is a really interesting one. I've talked to at Michigan, we have a nuclear engineering program. They feel like nuclear is better, right? We need small nuclear, we need to put it into places, and the kind of stigmatization of nuclear they are somewhat aghast at. At the same time, a lot of liberals, with some of the nuclear effects that we've seen, whether it's 3 Mile Island years ago or Fukushima, the kind of sense of this catastrophic impact of nuclear, I think, resonates more with the liberal value set than with Republicans. Republicans tend to be more supportive of these kind of like power plant manufacturers. So it includes nuclear, natural gas, coal. It's just it fits into that broader family, which aligns with it with greater support for it. So does that answer your question? Sort of. Okay. Okay.
Could you give us some more of your thoughts, and even if they aren't fully backed up, but you have some intuition about the root causes of the divergence over time between the Republicans and Democrats? And is it really a core value set, or is it something like the media industrial complex where some outlets have learned to monetize and make more money out of creating wedge issues that are highly effective, and they lock in people, and there's affirmation bias, and there's confirmation positive attributes where, okay, we grab this idea that you had some belief in, and then we keep reinforcing it, and through that reinforcing, we get you to watch more, we get more advertising revenue, and it's purely a profit play more than a particular value set of a media industrial complex, how you can do it. So do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, and I do have thoughts about that. So I'll share a few of them. So one is, I think people tend to trust, so actually there's a lot of literature on this. People tend to trust sources of information when what they're saying aligns with what you already believe, right? Dan Kahan has a number of these studies where if you take prestigious scientific experts, people will think that they're more credible, that they're more of an expert if they're giving viewpoints that align with their own predisposition. And he's shown that with gun control, with climate change, and a few other issues. And nuclear energy was it was nuclear waste storage was the other issue. So I think that is something that can amplify polarization. I also think you see it here with, do you trust it, with this kind of divide going on that starts with the Trump administration, right? So as the mass media is, I think, both referencing things Trump is saying, but also being critical of it, you see an increase in trust by Democrats while you see a decrease for Republicans, so that's there. Now when you look at this, I think a question is, how do you define the mass media? I think for sources you trust, I don't think it's that you distrust it more, right? So if you're conservative, there's maybe a smaller group that you trust, but at the same time, there's a high degree of trust with that small group of media sources. In terms of this kind of change, though, I mean, if you look at what a lot of the political elite are saying, and I always think of like Palin saying the lamestream media and things like that. The conservative elite opinion has been very vocal about criticizing mass media and saying you can't trust the mass media and you should only trust conservative sources. And I think that has resonated with a lot of conservatives and agreeing with that viewpoint. So I think...
Isn't that just ringing, hey, trust my media source, and therefore you watch my media source more, I get greater advertising revenue, and I purposely manipulate that view because it's my economic benefit more than any kind of value set.
Yeah, and I think, so when Fox News was first started by Ailes in the 90s, I mean, there was a market perspective that there is room in the U.S. news market for a conservative, like mainstream cable news source, and it was constructed on that. But I think it goes both ways. So there have been a few times during the Trump presidency, for example, that members of Fox News were pushing back against Trump, were questioning very hard. And so one, Trump pushed back against that, but also the viewership pushed back against that, right? So by Fox being less conservative, and I'd say being more critical of questioning, it affected their market share and it affected their profit margins, and they kind of quickly swung back to, I would say, being more supportive of the administration than they always were. So that kind of reciprocal cycle of both the audience and the news source kind of feeding into each other works. Fox News is incredibly profitable because it's the most trusted conservative news source in the U.S. right now. And
so if you go back to that chart that showed the spike.
Oh, this one?
That one.
Yeah.
So isn't that blue line CNN learning the same lesson from Fox and just doing the same thing on the left or the middle to the left?
Well, so this is public trust, but so the question is, I haven't seen that data set of like how does CNN coverage change over this time period, right? And that's the question you're asking. I don't know that off the top of my head.
All right, we'll go for 2 more questions here.
So this question is about your conclusion that when climate change is not mentioned, that increases policy support. Is that accurate?
I would say for some issues, for some policies, it will reduce Republican opposition if you don't mention climate change. That's how I'd phrase that.
Okay.
But yeah.
So in 2019, I listened to Secretary James Baker talk about his carbon dividend plan, and he calls it a dividend plan instead of a carbon tax because he's trying to get the Republican vote on that. And when he was giving the presentation to a room full of oil and gas industry leaders, he went ahead and said, look, I'm not sure I believe in climate change, but if climate change exists, we need to take action. So I guess my question is, in your research, did you take into account that aspect of introducing climate change into the discussion, how he phrased it? So he didn't say climate change exists or climate change doesn't exist. Instead, he kind of went in between and said, look, I'm not sure if it exists, but if these scientists are right, we need to do something about it. So has any of your research discussed or looked at the impact of that statement?
So I haven't personally researched that. I know that Frank Luntz did some polling on taking a similar kind of approach, is like taking action to address climate change has all these additional side benefits, even if we're wrong about climate change, right? And that seemed to resonate with a lot of people. So that's, if you trust Frank Luntz's kind of focus group approach that he takes. He's a primarily conservative focus group pollster, but he did some work and it seemed to suggest that that kind of approach might resonate with conservative audiences. I haven't personally done that, and I haven't seen academic scholarship that has played with that, but it may exist and I just didn't look at it. Yeah.
Just a comment and then a question. I think I would disagree with you on the Montreal Protocol on the ozone hole, because the Montreal Protocol was a regulatory scheme. Now, dealing with CFCs is obviously much different than CO2. The question is, have you looked at your results and compared those with any similar studies in Europe or Asia?
So the imagery stuff, that there are a number of European studies that have been done, but again, they use the Q-sort approach, and their findings largely replicate what O'Neill found, meaning that they found that impact imagery and kind of impact style of text, actually they didn't look at text, they only looked at imagery, but impact imagery seemed to reduce efficacy. They didn't do experimental testing, right, which is what I did, so there might be something about that method that is changing the result. The issue is far less polarizing in Europe, right? And so you don't have the same kind of like elite opinion guiding thing. So I would expect the results to differ there, but all of my research has primarily looked at what is somewhat a unique artifact of this polarization on this issue in the U.S., which doesn't exist. It's not as strong for sure in Europe, and I was actually talking to some students, and one of my PhD students is from South Korea, and they were saying that it's not as polarizing there as well for those kind of studies. Yeah. Yep.
Okay, thank you, Saul. Thank you for a great talk and great discussion. Thank you for the questions. Let's give them a hand.
Thanks, everyone.
Students in the class, can you make sure you sign in the back of the room over here? We do take attendance for every class, so please, I'm the teaching assistant, so please do sign in if you're enrolled in the class.